I remember the first time I decided to stay alone in that cabin. It wasn't some luxurious lodge or anything, just a small, wooden structure tucked deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest road. The kind of place that promised peace, silence, and a break from the noise of life. I had driven there late in the afternoon, my car rattling over the uneven dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust that settled on the pine trees lining the path. The air smelled sharp, fresh, and a little damp from the morning rain. At first, I felt a thrill. This was exactly the kind of isolation I'd been craving. But as the light faded, a creeping tension started to settle in my chest, subtle at first, then harder to ignore. The cabin was simple. One room, a tiny kitchen area with a sink that barely worked, a wood stove, and a loft bed I would sleep on. The walls were made of rough logs, and the floorboards creaked under every step. It had a small porch which looked out over a clearing that gradually gave way to dense trees. I unpacked my things, stacked some firewood near the stove, and decided to make a small dinner. The sun dipped lower, and the forest transformed. Shadows grew long, and the chirping of birds was replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and distant animal calls. There was something about that sound, something primal and unknowable, that made me aware I was not just alone, but entirely at the mercy of the forest around me. After eating, I built a fire in the stove. The warmth was comforting, the flames dancing against the walls, casting flickering shadows that made the cabin seem alive. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but my mind kept drifting to the noises outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, branches brushing against the roof or walls. But then I heard something different. A sharp crack of wood somewhere in the clearing beyond the porch, distinct and deliberate, not like a falling branch. I froze, listening. There was a pause, then a heavier sound, like a footstep pressing against the damp earth. My heartbeat spiked. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon, but it didn't feel right. The sound repeated, slow, methodical, coming closer, stopping, then moving again. I went to the window and peeked out. The dusk made it hard to see anything, just shadows stretching between trees. But then I caught a glimpse of movement, something tall, hunched, moving cautiously between the trunks. I blinked, thinking it was my imagination, but it was there again, staying just out of the clearing, in the shadows. I stepped back from the window, trying to steady my breathing. I thought about calling someone, but there was no cell service. That was when the reality hit me. If something was out there, I was completely alone with no one to help me. I tried to convince myself it was probably nothing. Animals do strange things at night, maybe a hunter or someone lost. But the feeling in my gut wouldn't let me ignore it. Every sound outside, the crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig, made me tense. I decided to lock the door and windows, even though I hadn't considered it necessary before. The door's old latch rattled as I slid it into place, and I felt the cabin shrink around me. I moved back toward the stove, hoping the fire would make me feel safer, but my eyes kept darting to the darkened window. Night fully arrived. The darkness outside was so thick it seemed to press against the glass. The sounds became clearer, branches snapping under weight, leaves rustling in ways that didn't fit with the wind. And then I heard a different noise, a low thud, like something heavy hitting the ground near the porch. I couldn't see anything, but the sound made my stomach knot. I tried to tell myself to stay calm, to rationalize. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe it was just a log falling. But the pattern of movement, the careful, deliberate sounds, felt human or at least intelligent. Something was out there, waiting, watching. I went to the door and quietly pushed it open, enough to peek outside. The porch was empty, but I saw footprints in the soft earth, just beyond the clearing. They weren't animal tracks. They were large, and the spacing between them was uneven, like whoever had left them had been moving cautiously, pausing, turning. I stepped back, my hand brushing against the wall for balance. I didn't know what to do. The cabin felt both protective and confining at the same time. I considered leaving, running back down the road, but the thought of stepping into the dark, trees pressing in on all sides, filled me with a different kind of terror. Hours passed. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the figure moving closer, just beyond the trees. I didn't sleep, couldn't. The fire burned low, but I was too afraid to go to the loft. I huddled near the stove, my knees pulled up, listening. By early morning, the noises had stopped. There was a stillness that made my nerves scream. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside, the clearing was empty, but the footprints were still there. They led into the woods and then vanished. I studied them carefully. They were large, human-sized, and there was no doubt they had come very close to the cabin. I knew I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, trying not to make noise. Every crack of a branch underfoot felt deafening. I got to my car, started the engine, and didn't look back as I drove down the dirt road, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles went white. I didn't stop for anything until I reached the nearest town, still hours away, still shaking. Looking back now, I realized what scared me most wasn't just the figure outside the cabin, or the footprints, or the night itself. It was the complete absence of control, the realization that I was completely vulnerable. No one would have found me if something had happened. The forest doesn't care about fear, and the cabin, for all its walls and logs, couldn't keep me safe from someone or something, intent on staying hidden until the moment it chose to act. After that night, I never stayed in a remote cabin alone again. I researched wilderness safety, learned about how to make a cabin secure, how to recognize signs of people or predators nearby. I realized that fear is both instinct and teacher. It keeps you alert, makes you notice things you might otherwise ignore. The next time I went into the woods, it was with preparation. Food, water, tools, a way to communicate, and a plan to leave quickly. The fear didn't go away completely, but it was no longer paralyzing. I had turned it into vigilance. I still remember the footprints, the way the forest seemed alive in a way it shouldn't have been, the cold certainty that I was being watched. But I also remember the relief of driving away, leaving the cabin behind, and learning that preparation and awareness are the only real defenses when you're alone in the wilderness. That night was terrifying, yes, but it ended with me safe, and it taught me how to survive, how to respect the unknown, and how to stay alive when everything in the woods is designed to remind you that you are small, vulnerable, and alone. The memory of that night stays with me, but it doesn't haunt me. It guides me, and sometimes, when I pass a dense forest or a quiet cabin, I think about that night, not with fear, but with understanding. Fear saved me, and awareness carried me home. That was the scariest night of my life, and I survived it entirely because I refused to panic, because I stayed alert, because I respected the forest and the unknown within it. I learned something crucial that night. The real horror isn't in ghosts or myths. It's in isolation, in the unknown, in the very real presence of someone or something, observing you unseen, in a place where no one can hear your screams. And the ending isn't about terror. It's about survival, about learning, about taking what could have destroyed you and turning it into experience. I drove home with the dawn breaking behind me, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror, and I made a silent promise. Never again would I underestimate what alone really means. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The idea of a week alone in a remote cabin, surrounded by forest, had seemed peaceful, almost therapeutic. I wanted to get away from work, from the constant notifications on my phone, from everything. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. The directions were simple enough. Take the main highway north, then a gravel road that wound through dense forest for nearly an hour until I reached the clearing where the cabin sat. I left early in the morning, my car packed with supplies. A backpack with food, water, a first aid kit, a small lantern, and enough clothing to last a week. The drive was longer and more difficult than I expected. The gravel road was narrow, twisting between trees that leaned close enough to scratch the sides of the car. The further I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, no wind rustling the leaves. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive. I kept glancing at the dark forest around me, feeling the weight of isolation pressing in from every side. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin came into view. It was a small wooden structure, dark and weathered, with a sagging porch and warped roof. The windows were streaked with dust, and the wood had aged unevenly, cracked in places where rain had seeped through over the years. Beyond the clearing, a lake reflected the forest like black glass, the water still and lifeless under the late afternoon sun. I parked my car, stepped out, and immediately felt a chill. The air was damp, thick with the smell of moss and decaying leaves. I carried my bag across the creaking porch, feeling every board shift under my weight. Inside, the cabin was dim and dusty. The smell of old wood and mildew filled the small space. Furniture was sparse. A lumpy mattress in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and a wooden shelf with a few tattered books. The kitchen had a rust-streaked sink and a small stove, neither of which looked like they had been used recently. I set my bag down and started cleaning, brushing away dust and spiderwebs, sweeping the floor and wiping down counters. Small piles of rodent droppings reminded me that I was stepping into a space that had been largely abandoned. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, the cabin felt darker than it should. I built a fire in the fireplace, the warmth spreading slowly but unevenly through the room. I ate a simple dinner, warming canned beans on the stove, and listened to the fire's crackle. Outside, the forest was eerily silent. Not a bird, not a squirrel, not even the wind moving the trees. The stillness felt unnatural. I told myself it was just the remoteness, that being alone in the woods made every sound, or lack of sound, more noticeable. I went for a short walk around the cabin with a flashlight, checking the perimeter. The beam barely penetrated the shadows, and the trees looked taller, darker, and more menacing than they had in daylight. The lake, once peaceful, now looked like a dark void. Every snapped twig underfoot sounded amplified, making me jump with each step. I didn't stay out long and returned quickly to the cabin, shutting and locking the doors behind me. The sense of being watched didn't leave me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just nerves. Sleep was light and uneasy. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound that made my stomach tighten. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My heart pounded as I listened, frozen, gripping the flashlight. The steps stopped near the porch for a moment, then continued around the cabin, never rushed, always measured. The silence afterward felt heavier than the sound, pressing in from every corner of the room. Morning brought no relief. I stepped outside to inspect the area and found footprints in the soft, damp soil. They were bare feet, long and narrow, some pressing deeply as if the person had paused to stand and watch. The tracks circled the cabin completely, ending near the edge of the clearing. There were no other signs, no tools, no litter, nothing else to indicate the presence of another human. The realization that someone had been there, watching, made my stomach churn. I tried to convince myself it was a local living in the woods, perhaps someone off the grid, but the thought brought little comfort. I kept the doors locked, windows latched, and focused on small tasks. Gathering firewood, cleaning, organizing supplies. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch made me flinch. Even in daylight, the forest felt oppressive, almost predatory. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and the path to the lake felt like a corridor leading into the unknown. That night, sleep was impossible. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something dragging across the porch. Slow, heavy, deliberate. The footsteps returned, closer this time, accompanied by soft, uneven taps on the window beside my bed. My heart raced and I didn't move. I didn't turn on the flashlight, afraid of what I might see. Eventually, the tapping stopped and the footsteps faded again, leaving an oppressive silence. Morning revealed more disturbing signs. The footprints were fresh, leading from the tree line to the window where I had slept, then circling the cabin once more. On a tree near the porch hung a small bird, dead, tied with rough twine. Its feathers were stiff, its head hanging downward. Whoever had been here was deliberate, making sure I understood I was being watched. I packed my belongings quickly, shaking, hands trembling. I left nothing behind. Approaching the cabin door, I noticed deep scratches running vertically across it, like nails dragged down in frustration or warning. I didn't stop, I ran to my car, started the engine, and drove down the gravel road without looking back. For miles, nothing happened. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I had imagined some of it, that nerves and isolation were amplifying my fears. But then, about 20 minutes into the drive, I saw it. A figure in the trees, barely visible, barefoot, standing still, watching. I gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white, and didn't slow down. I didn't glance back until the highway opened and the forest thinned. I debated calling the police, but what could I say? Footprints, a dead bird, scratches on a door, and a shadowy figure? It would have sounded insane. I drove straight to the nearest town and didn't stop until I reached my apartment. I didn't eat, didn't think, didn't breathe properly for the first hour of being home. Months later, the memories linger. The silence of the forest, the footsteps circling the cabin, the dead bird on the tree, the scratches on the door, and the figure in the shadows are all still vivid. I never stayed alone in a remote cabin again. I avoid places without cell service, without neighbors, without any way to call for help. Sometimes, in quiet moments at night, I swear I hear a soft tap on a window, a reminder of the woods, the cabin, and the person who had been there, patient, deliberate, and watching. The experience taught me the weight of isolation, the vulnerability of being truly alone, and the realization that there are people who seek control through fear. The forest didn't scare me because of darkness or animals. It scared me because of the certainty that someone had been there, observing, studying, and waiting for the right moment. That awareness never leaves. Even now, years later, I sometimes imagine the forest, the quiet, the lake, and the cabin, and I know I will never be alone in a remote place again. The fear isn't in what might happen, it's in knowing that it already did, and that the person responsible could still be out there, waiting for another chance. I drove up to the cabin thinking it would be a quiet break from everything. Life had been busy and loud, and the idea of being in a small wooden cabin surrounded by forest sounded peaceful. The place wasn't fancy. It was old, with dark wood walls, a metal roof, and a small porch facing a lake. The nearest town was almost an hour away, and the dirt road leading there was narrow and rough. By the time I parked and stepped out, the air felt colder than it should have been, and the woods around me were completely silent. Not even birds. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and dust. There was one small bedroom, a kitchen area with a rusty sink, and a fireplace made of stone. It looked like no one had been there for years. I dropped my bag on the bed and looked out the window facing the lake. The water was dark and still, with tall trees crowding the shoreline. The silence felt heavy. I spent the first couple of hours cleaning. Dust covered everything, and there were mouse droppings in the corners. I swept the floor, wiped the counters, and made the bed. The sun started going down while I worked, and by the time I finished, the inside of the cabin felt darker than it should have. I lit a few candles and set up a small fire in the fireplace because the place was colder than expected. I made a simple dinner and ate quietly. The crackling from the fire was the only sound. No wind, no rain, no insects, nothing. I tried to ignore how strange that felt. Forests are never silent, but this one was. Before going to sleep, I walked outside with a flashlight. The beam barely cut through the darkness. The lake looked black, and the trees looked like tall shadows. I didn't stay out long. Something about the stillness made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't fear exactly, just a feeling that something wasn't right. Inside, I locked the door, even though it felt silly. I checked it twice before finally laying down in bed. The mattress was old and lumpy, but I was tired. The fire was still burning a little when I closed my eyes. I woke up sometime during the night. At first, I didn't know what pulled me out of sleep, but then I realized I could hear footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, steady footsteps on the dry leaves. I froze. My breathing went shallow, and my heart felt like it was beating too fast. I listened carefully. The steps moved from one side of the cabin to the other. Not fast, not rushed, just steady. Could have been an animal, but the steps sounded too even, too heavy. They stopped near the porch. For a long time, there was no sound, just silence. I stared at the dark window, half expecting a face to appear, but nothing happened. I stayed awake listening. I didn't hear the footsteps again, but I also didn't fall back asleep. When the first week daylight showed through the curtains, I finally got out of bed. I walked outside slowly. My mouth felt dry, and my hands were cold. The ground around the cabin was covered in leaves and mud. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then I noticed the footprints. Not boots, bare feet. The prints were long and narrow, and they went all the way around the cabin. Some prints were deeper than others, like whoever made them had stopped and stood in place for a while. The ones near the porch were heavier, pressed deep into the dirt. My stomach tightened in a way I couldn't control. I walked the property trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone was lost. Maybe someone lived somewhere in the woods. Maybe someone was messing with me. None of those ideas helped. I stayed outside only long enough to look. Then I went back in and locked the door again, this time making sure every latch and window was secure. I checked my phone, but there was no service, not even one bar. The whole day felt strange. Every small noise made me jump. A twig snapping somewhere in the distance made me stop breathing for a second. I tried to calm myself by keeping busy. I gathered firewood, cleaned more, and tried to read one of the old books left in the cabin, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the windows. As the sun went down again, the silence returned. It wasn't peaceful. It was tense, almost like the forest was holding its breath. I ate dinner quickly and kept the fire going bigger that night. I brought the flashlight into bed with me and kept it in my hand. I didn't sleep for long. A sound woke me again. Not footsteps this time. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy sliding across the porch. My body tensed instantly. The dragging stopped, and then came that same slow stepping sound. This time, the steps were closer, more cautious. They stopped right outside the window next to the bed. I stayed completely still. My breathing was shallow, and I stared at the dark outline of the window. The cabin was so quiet I could hear my heartbeat. After a few seconds that felt much longer, I heard something tap the window. Just once. Soft but clear. A single tap. I didn't move. I didn't turn on the flashlight. I just waited. Another tap happened. Then another. It wasn't hard. It was like fingers gently tapping the glass. Eventually, the tapping stopped. Then the footsteps moved again. Slow. Careful. They circled the cabin just like the night before, then faded into the distance. I stayed frozen until morning. When daylight came, I went outside again. My body felt heavy and tired, and my nerves were shot. The bare footprints were there again, fresher this time. They started at the tree line and went straight to the window by my bed. Then they circled the cabin again. I followed the prints toward the trees, but I stopped when I saw something stuck to the bark of a tree. A small dead bird. It was tied to the trunk with a thin piece of rough twine. The bird had been placed there on purpose. Its feathers were stiff, and its head hung downward. Something about it made my stomach twist. I backed away and returned to the cabin. I grabbed my keys and decided I needed to leave. I didn't care if I had only been there 2 days. I packed my things fast, barely folding anything. When I stepped outside with my bag, I noticed something I missed before. My cabin door had deep scratch marks in it. Not random. There were 5 long, straight scratches down the middle of the wood, like someone dragged their fingers or nails across it. I didn't waste more time. I locked the cabin and walked quickly to my car. The whole forest felt like it was watching. I got inside, started the engine, and drove back down the dirt road, checking the mirror more than I usually would. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, maybe 15 or 20 minutes into the drive, something made me glance into the woods beside the road. In the trees, far enough away to be hidden by shadows, but close enough that I could still see the shape. Someone was standing, barefoot, still, watching. I couldn't see a face, just a tall, thin outline. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I kept driving until I reached the highway and didn't look back again. When I finally got service, I considered calling the police. But what was I supposed to say? I didn't know who it was. I didn't know what they wanted. All I knew was that someone had been watching me. Someone walked barefoot in the woods. Someone tapped on the glass while I slept. Someone scratched the door. Someone placed that bird there. I never went back to that cabin, and I never rented another place that isolated again. Even now, sometimes at night, when everything is quiet and still, I think about those footsteps. And sometimes I wonder if whoever was out there still watches cabins, waiting for someone to stay alone long enough. And sometimes, before I fall asleep, I think I hear a soft tap on the window, just once. I had planned this trip for months, thinking it would be a chance to disconnect from everything and just be alone in the woods. The cabin I rented was in the northern part of the state, far from any town or road that saw regular traffic. The directions said to follow the main highway until it ended, then turn onto a gravel road that would wind through the forest for about an hour. I left early in the morning, the air crisp and cold, and drove carefully. The road was narrow, with trees so close to the sides that at some points I had to angle the car to avoid scraping branches. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, even the wind barely made a sound. It was the kind of silence that made me feel like the forest itself was holding its breath. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, I was both relieved and unsettled. The cabin was small and wooden, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Its dark stain was faded, the porch boards uneven and warped from moisture, and the roof sagged slightly in the center. A small lake lay beyond the clearing, its water flat and dark, reflecting the surrounding trees in sharp, jagged shapes. I parked the car and stepped out, stretching, feeling the cold bite of the wind. The air smelled like wet earth and pine, the scent of the forest heavy after last night's rain. Inside, the cabin was dim, even with daylight streaming through the windows. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of old wood and mildew. There was a small kitchen area with a rust-streaked sink and a counter chipped in several places, a lumpy mattress in one corner, and a stone fireplace that looked unused for decades. The furniture was sparse. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a small bookshelf with a few tattered books, and an old armchair covered in dust. I set my bag down, took a deep breath, and began cleaning. The dust and spiderwebs made me sneeze repeatedly, and small rodent droppings in the corners reminded me that the cabin was hardly in use. I swept and wiped, trying to get rid of the feeling that I was intruding on something long abandoned. By the time the sun began to dip behind the trees, the cabin felt darker than it should. I built a small fire in the fireplace, the warmth spreading slowly through the room, and made a simple dinner on the small stove. The silence outside was almost overwhelming. Not a bird, not a squirrel, not even the wind rustling through the leaves. The forest seemed still, heavy, and watchful. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just isolation, that being alone made the senses sharper, made every little sound echo in the mind. I went for a short walk around the cabin, flashlight in hand, to get my bearings. The beam barely penetrated the shadows of the trees. The lake looked black, still, and somehow hostile in the dim light. Every branch that snapped underfoot sounded loud, unnatural. I didn't stay out long, moving quickly back to the cabin, shutting and locking the door behind me. The forest pressed close to the windows, a wall of dark green and black, and I felt a chill run down my spine. That night I slept lightly. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, they moved from one side of the cabin to the other, pausing near the porch before continuing. My heart pounded and I froze, listening. The steps stopped for a few seconds, then moved again, never hurried, always careful. I couldn't see anyone through the thin curtains. The silence that followed was heavy and almost suffocating, broken only by the faint sound of my own breathing. Morning didn't bring much relief. I stepped outside carefully, trying to understand what had happened. The ground was soft from rain, and footprints marked the dirt. Bare feet, long and narrow, deep in some areas, lighter in others, as if whoever made them had paused to stand or inspect the cabin. The prints circled the entire cabin and led back toward the tree line, stopping at the edge of the clearing. There were no other signs of life, no tools, no discarded food, nothing. Just the tracks and the uneasy realization that someone had been there. I went back inside, trying to stay calm, telling myself it was someone living off the grid, perhaps a local who wandered the forest. I kept the doors locked and windows latched, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I tried to keep busy. I gathered more firewood, swept, organized my supplies, and even explored the nearby area a little during daylight, trying to calm myself. The forest, though beautiful in sunlight, still felt oppressive, a silent observer. That evening, as darkness fell, the forest's quietness returned. The fire in the fireplace cracked and popped, casting flickering shadows. I ate quickly and kept the fire high, determined to stay alert. My sleep that night was restless. Around midnight, a dragging sound woke me. A slow, heavy scrape across the porch. My body tensed instantly. Then came the footsteps again, closer this time. I could hear a soft tap on the window beside the bed. A deliberate knock, repeated in uneven intervals. My heart raced, adrenaline flooding my system. I gripped the flashlight and stayed completely still, listening to every sound. Eventually, the tapping and steps stopped, leaving a suffocating silence that lasted until dawn. When morning came, I stepped outside cautiously. The footprints were fresh. They led from the tree line straight to the window where I had been sleeping, then circled the cabin again. On a tree near the porch, something hung. A small bird, dead, tied to the trunk with a rough twine. Its feathers were stiff, its head hanging downward. Someone had placed it there deliberately. My stomach churned. I packed my things quickly, my hands trembling. I took everything I had brought, making sure nothing was left behind. As I approached the car, I noticed the door to the cabin. Deep scratches ran vertically down the center of the wood, like nails dragged deliberately across it. My chest tightened. I didn't stop to investigate further. I got into the car, started the engine, and began the long drive back down the winding gravel road. For several miles, nothing happened. I kept glancing into the shadows between the trees, expecting to see someone lurking, but the forest seemed empty. Then, about 20 minutes into the drive, I saw it. A figure standing far in the trees, barely visible but unmistakable. Barefoot, tall, thin, completely still. Watching, I didn't slow down. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white. The figure didn't move, didn't disappear, just remained in the shadows. I didn't look back until I reached the highway and a stretch of road where the forest was further away. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on me, that someone had been tracking me through the woods. I debated calling the police, but I didn't know what to report. Footprints, a dead bird, scratches on a door, a shadowy figure. It would have sounded insane. I kept driving until I reached the nearest town and then straight to my apartment, not stopping, not thinking about anything except leaving the forest behind. Even now, months later, the memory lingers. I remember the oppressive silence of the forest, the chill of the cabin, the heavy steps circling in the night. I remember the bird tied to the tree, the scratches on the door, and the figure in the shadows. I can't explain what happened, and I don't know if I want to. All I know is that the forest is still out there, and that someone or something waits in the woods, patient and deliberate. Since that trip, I never stayed alone in a remote cabin again. I never returned to places without cell service. And sometimes, in quiet moments at night, I swear I hear a soft tap on a window, a reminder of the woods and the silent watcher who haunted that cabin. I arrived at the cabin in late afternoon, the kind of quiet where every sound seems sharper than it should be. The dirt road had been long and bumpy, winding through thick forest for nearly an hour, and by the time I turned onto the narrow path that led to the cabin itself, my arms were sore from holding the steering wheel steady. The trees leaned close to the road, and the sunlight barely touched the ground in some places. I parked in a small clearing in front of the cabin, stepping out into air that smelled damp and earthy. There was no one else around. Not a car, not a person, Nothing but the soft hum of the wind through the trees. The cabin looked older than I expected. Its dark wooden walls were streaked with age, and the roof sagged slightly near the center. The porch was narrow, with loose boards that creaked under my weight as I walked across it. A small lake was visible past the clearing, its water still and glassy, reflecting the forest around it like a dark mirror. The cabin itself was simple inside. There was a small kitchen area with a rusty sink, a single burner stove, and a counter covered in scratches and stains. The walls smelled of old wood, dust, and a faint, sour odor that reminded me of damp clothes left too long in a closet. The furniture was minimal. A small wooden table with 2 chairs, a lumpy mattress in the corner, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The windows were thin and old, letting in very little light as the sun continued its slow descent. I set my things down, stretching my back. I had packed lightly, just a backpack with food, water, a first aid kit, and a small lantern. I decided to start cleaning right away. Dust and cobwebs coated every surface, and small rodent droppings were scattered around the corners. The air inside was still thick with the scent of damp wood. I swept the floor carefully, trying to shake off the unease I felt as I worked. By the time I finished, the last streaks of sunlight were slipping behind the trees, leaving the forest and cabin shrouded in shadows. I lit a small fire in the fireplace, which filled the room with a comforting warmth and a soft crackle. I prepared a simple dinner on the stove, a can of beans warmed with a little spice, and ate slowly, listening to the fire. Outside, the forest was quiet. Too quiet. There was no chirping of birds, no rustling of small animals, just an oppressive stillness that pressed against the cabin walls. I decided to take a walk outside before it got fully dark. The flashlight in my hand barely cut through the shadows. The lake, which had seemed serene earlier, now looked black and unfriendly. The trees appeared taller, more jagged, and the shadows seemed to move as I shifted my gaze. I didn't stay out long. The silence was unnerving, and I felt eyes on me even though I knew there was no one there. Back inside, I double-checked the door and windows, even though I didn't expect anyone to be there. I told myself I was being paranoid. The forest was vast and remote. It would be impossible for someone to reach the cabin unnoticed. I went to bed with the fire still burning low and the flashlight by my side. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. There was a sound outside, soft but distinct, the crunch of leaves underfoot. I froze, listening. It was slow, deliberate. Footsteps circled the cabin, moving from one side to the other, stopping for a few seconds at each corner before continuing. They were heavy enough to sink slightly into the soil, and they weren't like an animal's movements. My stomach twisted, and I gripped the flashlight, afraid to move. The steps stopped suddenly near the front door, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Morning brought little relief. I stepped outside cautiously, flashlight in hand, and saw footprints around the cabin. They were bare feet, long and narrow, some pressing deeply into the dirt. The prints went all the way around the cabin and stopped near the porch, suggesting whoever had made them had paused there. My hands trembled as I examined them. There was no sign of anything else, no dropped items, no disturbance of the surrounding brush. Just the footprints and the sense that someone had been watching me all night. I went back inside, trying to convince myself it was some lost hiker, maybe a local living off the grid. I secured the doors and windows again and tried to focus on mundane tasks. Cleaning more, gathering firewood, checking the supplies I had brought. Every snap of a branch outside made my heart leap. By evening, I had stopped eating, too nervous to cook. The forest had gone completely silent again, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. I lit the fire higher, letting the flames cast dancing shadows across the room, and tried to read one of the old books left in the cabin. The words made no sense. My mind kept returning to the footsteps, to the prints, to the unshakable feeling of being watched. I fell into a light, uneasy sleep. When I woke again, it was to a different sound. Something dragging across the porch. My body froze. It was slow, deliberate, almost as if someone was testing the wood. Then came the footsteps again, closer this time. They paused outside the window beside my bed. I could hear a light tap on the glass. Just once. Then another. Then another. My heart raced and I didn't move. I didn't turn on the flashlight. Couldn't. My mind screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my eyes locked on the window. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cold seeped into the room. I barely slept. When the first gray light of dawn appeared, I stepped outside to investigate. The footprints were fresh. They led from the tree line to the window where the tapping had occurred, then around the cabin again. On one tree near the porch, I saw something that made my stomach turn. A small dead bird, tied to the trunk with a rough piece of twine. Its feathers were stiff, its head hanging limply. The bird had been placed there deliberately. I didn't linger. I packed my things as quickly as possible, making sure to take everything with me. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking, but I forced myself to stay calm. As I approached my car, I noticed the door had been scratched. Deep, long lines ran vertically across the wood, as if someone had dragged their nails down it in frustration or warning. I got in the car and started the engine, glancing nervously into the trees as I drove away. For a long stretch of the dirt road, nothing happened. I told myself I was overreacting, that the forest had just played tricks on my senses. But then, 15 minutes into the drive, I looked into the shadows between the trees. There, barely visible but unmistakable, was a figure. Barefoot, tall, thin, standing still among the trees. It didn't move. It didn't turn. It just watched. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white. The highway finally came into view, and I didn't look back until I was well past the last curve of the forest road. When I reached an area with cell phone signal, I debated calling the police. But what could I say? A stranger had been watching me, leaving footprints and scratching the door. They might have left something else I didn't see. I could only describe the footprints and the bird, and that would sound crazy. I didn't return to the cabin. I don't plan to. Even now, months later, the memory lingers. I remember the heavy silence of the forest, the cold air inside the cabin, the sound of footsteps circling in the dark. I remember the bird tied to the tree, the scratches on the door, and the figure watching from the shadows. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about that cabin and the person or whatever it was that waited in the woods. I think about the deliberate, slow way they moved, the way they circled the cabin, the way they made sure I knew they were there. And sometimes, just as I start to drift off to sleep, I imagine the soft tap of nails on a window. It's a sound I will never forget. Even now, I know the woods are still out there, still quiet, still watching. And I know I will never be alone in a cabin in the middle of the forest again.